Jobs empower individuals, reduce poverty, enhance well-being, and drive social stability and economic growth. Africa's largest and growing age group, its youth population, is also its least gainfully employed. Of Africa's over 400 million youth aged between 15 and 35, an estimated 2/3 are either unemployed or vulnerably employed. By 2050, Africa is expected to account for 1/4 of the world's working age population, making youth employment a critical issue not just for Africa, but for the rest of the world. As part of the Oxford Martin School's Future of Development program, this podcast series, Africa Which Way Employment, delves into strategies for creating decent jobs that elevate incomes and ensure economic progress across the continent. Hello and welcome to Africa Which Way Employment, a series dedicated to unpacking the multi-layered facets of employment on the continent, to showcasing individuals and initiatives that are driving positive socioeconomic change, and to inspire actionable solutions to inclusive livelihoods and economic equity. My name is Oluwatamilore Oni, and today I'm in Nairobi, joined by Sharmi Surianarain, Chief Impact Officer of Harambe Youth Employment Accelerator. Sharmi has extensive experience in the human capital development, education, and employment linkage space across Africa, India, and the United States. Prior to Harambe, Sharmi served as the Vice President of Lifelong Engagement at the Africa Leadership Academy, where she oversaw a wide network of young African leaders. She's also the founder of Making Caring Count, a social enterprise that aims to build impactful solutions around care work in Africa. And I'll just also add that she's a singer, songwriter, and jazz musician. And because I love music so much, I had to add that in. Thank you so very much for making the time to be here, Sharmi. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
It's my pleasure, Tammy. Nice to see you.
We can go straight into it. There's quite a few different things that I would like to discuss. I was saying a few minutes beforehand that I'm really excited about this conversation because I feel like there are not a lot of organizations on the continent that are focused specifically on the employment end-to-end pipeline in terms of how do we get young people to jobs and have actually dedicated years of work and have learned so much as well in this space. So it's great to see, and I guess it would be great to unpack the work that you're doing and kind of share more about that. But before we go into the meat of the issue, I'm asking all my guests one question to share a job story from their own past, personal job story, something fun or disappointing or interesting about your career and job search past.
Well, thank you, Tammy, for the question. You made me think and walk down memory lane a little bit. So my first paid job experience was both incredibly richly rewarding, but also somewhat disappointing on some level. So I was an undergraduate at Harvard University and I was a scholarship student, and I had to do a paid campus job as part of my scholarship requirement. And the campus job that I was assigned was something called dorm crew, which meant I had to clean toilets. And look, I'm not a stranger to domestic work, etc., but I think what was interesting was I had to do that at industrial strength and learn how to carry a mop and a bucket. And I had to also do this, I think it was reunion time. And so there were a lot of party goers. So there was a lot to clean up. But what it taught me, while it was disappointing in the sense that I thought I would have a fancy job, and I eventually did. But what was really richly rewarding was firstly it taught me a work ethic of needing to really work hard and to do the best you can no matter the job. And cleaning toilets is just as, respectable as any other kind. And secondly, it really made me respect the people who serve us on a daily basis. And I think that's also led into my ethos of what I value and the domestic work and the care industry. And it's something that I try and teach my children as well. So yes, dorm crew taught me a lot, and cleaning toilets in reunion season in a university can stretch the best of us. But I actually really valued that experience. And it's a work ethic that I take with me to this day, to not disregard the importance of the job, regardless of how small it might be. Because if you're too big to do the small things, you're too small to do the big things, which is a value that I hold quite dearly.
I love that. I think it's also just paints the humanity of, I guess, what jobs are, what work really stands for in every individual's life, right? There's so much more than just, it's a job or it's like XYZ hours of your life, but it sometimes defines your worldview, your perspective. It defines how you navigate the world, how you perceive yourself. And then you can then add on all the additional layers of like economic development and, this is GDP growth and innovation and so on and so forth. You've been in the youth employment space for a number of years now. You've worked at the Africa Leadership Academy, Harambe, Pratham, and you've experienced it from a variety of different perspectives. What would you say have been the triumphs and trials over this time? And it's a broad, open-ended question, but I'm just curious about what you would say in terms of youth employment in Africa. What are some of the high points and maybe some low points that you've experienced within your own career?
Gosh, that's a great question. It's a complex question. I think a thread that has kind of been common throughout my life and work experience has been being in service of young people who I think have incredible potential. And I think particularly for me, in this stage of my life, the young people of Africa, for whom, there's immense potential that young people have. And it's the system that fails them, not the other way around. And I think for me, some of the triumphs have been, for example, even working at African Leadership Academy, where I led something called Africa Careers Network, connecting young people to jobs and internships across Africa. It was evident that, young people had talent in spades and the opportunities were insufficient, or they couldn't see the opportunities or access them, or they had, barriers that were insurmountable. So, for me, the potential of young people has been a common thread, and serving them has been sort of like the mission of my life. I think the challenge, I remember facing it at ALA and thinking it wasn't enough to just work with 1,000 young people. It wasn't enough just to service, get 500 internships. The problem was so large across both South Africa, where I was living at the time, but the continent really. And we have, 12 to 15 million young people entering the labor market every year. And it was just insufficient. And it was both a failure of the system, but also a failure of the imagination of all of us to not be able to harness this potential. And I think the challenges include, we're at the confluence of so many different things. Africa, we have been the most exploited continent. We have the legacy of so much to overcome. And yet we have so much potential. We have a demographic dividend. By 2030, we will be on our way to becoming the largest workforce in the world. And yet we are the confluence of, the legacies of colonization and apartheid. We have the legacy of sort of really exploitative practices. And also you add to that jobless growth, which is now common across not just Africa, but the rest of the developing world. So we're in a very particularly unique time, and young Africans are paying a price for all of those things that really wasn't sort of their burden to bear. And so for me, that really keeps me up at night because I think that young people, I work with young people every day, and they remind me how much there is to lose if we squander their potential. So I don't even see it as oh my goodness, what do we do with all the young people? Let's keep them busy. But for me, it's about potential and productivity that's wasted and squandered if we don't serve them and unleash their potential. So that's sort of what keeps me up at night. So the thread being the young people and their potential, the fact that scale and complexity makes this challenge really pressing and important to solve. And then the fact that we have a failure of systems and imagination. And we need to put all of our efforts to bear to try and solve this issue. That's kind of what keeps me going. And I love working with young people. They also remind me every single day how much I don't know. And I think that's a really good thing because we need reminders of what is possible, not young people aren't a burden or a problem to be solved. They're not the problem. They are the solution. So I think for me, those are sort of the mindsets that I bring into the work that I do that has cut across all of those sort of experiences in my career.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And you've actually touched on pretty much the three core things I'm going to talk about, or I wanted us to talk about in this time. So scale, the system failures, how do you kind of solve for that? And then also the question of jobless growth. But even before we go there, I think one thing that when you research and you read the articles from, the economists or the who are doing the microeconomic research and macroeconomic research, There's loads of different terms. There's what is a job versus employment versus work. ILO, for example, will say anyone who works more than 1 hour paid hour per week is employed, and definitions and measurements really vary depending on where we are. And then also to call out that Africa is not a country, right? So there's 54 different, sovereign states, and also having their own sort of different ecosystems and policies and frameworks for economic growth and, their economic pathways. But I'll actually give an example. I remember like in Nigeria, I think at the end of 2020, the unemployment rate was 33% based off of a 20-hour work week minimum. And then 2 years later, we decided to adopt the ILO, International Labour Organization standard, which is 1 hour, and then it becomes 5%. So what are you really solving for in that sort of, in the situation where numbers vary? How are you counting? What is the value of work? And when you then think about all the headlines, so for example, the IMF has this headline that, the clock is ticking on Sub-Saharan Africa's urgent job creation challenge. And The Economist is ranking youth employment along with climate change and nuclear weapon threats as like, this is urgent, we need to solve for it now. And I agree with that. I think that urgency is kind of why this whole series evolved and why we're doing this. But then the question is, how do you have some sort of unified approach to solving this at scale on the continent in a way that is meaningful and in a way that is really addressing not just the numbers, like you said, not just thinking about youth as, okay, these numbers, we're keeping them busy, but we're thinking about meaningful and dignified opportunities for work.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. No, this is stuff that keeps me up at night all the time. So let me answer your question in almost 2 to 3 parts. One, so you touched on measurement. What is a job and what is work and what is important? I'm going to get to that in a second. But prior to that, let's even get back to the philosophy of work, right? Like, I think we need to think a little bit differently, because work as we know it, as a formal job that you get paid to do, is a relatively recent innovation in some ways. Not all of it coming from the right sort of concepts, etc. I mean, let's not even go to sort of exploitative practices like slavery, etc. I'm talking about paid work in a formal sector employment context is reasonably recent. And I think it was also a product of industrialization and economies that were growing massively. And I think so there's 2 aspects to work, right? There's work as purpose and productivity, and then there's work as income generation. And I think in the past 50, 100 years of post-industrialization, and especially now, where economies look very different to what they did, we have to think quite differently about what the philosophical purpose of work is and what the value of work is in terms of decent work to get yourself a wage income. And there's a lot of debates in this space, right, between basic income grant proponents and people who want to think of work as meaningful in and of itself. I kind of find myself in between. Work has to serve both purposes. It has to be personally fulfilling. You need to work to feel fulfilled. It isn't enough that you are a person of leisure and, consume things. I mean, it's wonderful to have that. But work gives you purpose, and it doesn't have to be drudgery, etc. Work has to both give you purpose, but it also has to generate an income. But I think our philosophical view of work has been trapped in this sort of old school mindset. And I think Africa now is also being both kind of held to very high standards in a very difficult time for us to think of both work as the philosophical purpose, but also in terms of income generating, right? And that's why you get all of these statistics and stats that say we don't have enough jobs. We will never have enough jobs. We have people doing jobs that are incredibly exploitative. We're back to feudalism. All of that is true. But we're kind of now in a space where we're being measured by standards that are incredibly high and important to have, and in the middle of having to face consequences of choices made by many others and institutions, etc. So I think there's 2 or 3 things to unpack here. I personally think that work as we know it has to be redefined in terms of both purpose, productivity, and income. And we unfortunately may not be able to solve for all of those things at the same time. And I'll give the example of what we do at Harambe. We definitely think of work at least as an income generating opportunity. We have varying levels of duration in terms of what we measure. And you can be, for example, in a short-term work contract of 3 months and earn income and have that constitute work. But that isn't enough. And I think formal sector jobs, which everyone wants as this holy grail for every single economy, like the 12 to 15 million young people that I said enter the labor market every year in Africa, 30% roughly get formal sector jobs, but you probably will never get to 100%. So what is the happy medium of both purpose, productivity, and income that you can get to for the young people getting into the labor market every year is sort of the question I think we should be asking. And how do you make the work that young people are getting to be less precarious than it is right now? Because it is incredibly precarious. So you also have young people not doing anything. And I'll give an example of South Africa, for example. It keeps being sort of touted as the country with the highest unemployment in the world and highest youth unemployment in the world. 50-something%, 54 to 55%, which is really unconscionable. We're firstly, I think, also beholden to the fact that we're measuring unemployment, which is a big thing. Secondly, I love to quote this labor economist, Professor Harun Borat, that I cite a lot. He says a country of South Africa's GDP typically has 45% employed in the formal sector, 45% in the informal sector, and the rest unemployed. South Africa has 50% in the formal sector, roughly 20% in the informal sector, and the rest unemployed. And the reason that ends up being a problem is South Africa doesn't look like the rest of Africa. You have young people doing nothing versus young people hustling and earning something, even if it's precarious. So what he urges us to think about is, let's look at the shape of the economy. The shape of the economy has to shift, and it has to shift to support this youth dividend. And so it's very complex. It's not a straightforward answer. And I know I'm taking a long time to answer your question, which is, what is work? But work is complex, right? And I think right now, because we also have the rise of gig work, we have young people doing, 3 or 4 Uber jobs, whether you're doing a Uber boda or delivery and, selling or braiding hair on the side. It has to add up to something both meaningful for you as an individual, but also less precarious in terms of income. So you actually can take something home and take care of your basic needs. We are very far from that reality right now. And most of our politicians, our institutions, our governments want the holy grail of formal sector jobs. They want all of their young people in shiny offices, not realizing that the reality is actually the millions will be in this very precarious space. And in addition to prioritizing formal sector jobs, we need to de-risk this space as much as we can while we stimulate our economies for growth, etc. So I think what I'm trying to say is work is going to be complex and multifaceted, and you have to look at income, you have to look at precariousness, you have to look at duration. But you also cannot look for a silver bullet. Anyone who's been in this space, as long as we have, for example, 13 years, knows that. So Harambe, I'll just give a couple of stats. Since founding 13 years ago, we have enabled 1.4 million work opportunities for South Africans. Of those, I would say roughly 30% or slightly less are formal sector jobs. So that is not a lot of numbers, if you think about it. The majority are actually in public employment programs, which are sponsored and paid for by the state. And again, of the 1.4 million, roughly, I'd say 8% are net new jobs that Harambe has helped create as well. So that's the other aspect of this, is what are jobs that exist today versus jobs that you need to create for the future. So it's an incredibly complex space. It's not... you don't have a single solution. And I think my favorite saying now is that there are no silver bullets. There are no single solutions. And you need all of them. You need the informal work, and you need to de-risk that and make that less precarious. You need the formal sector jobs, and those will be few, but you need to grow those. You need publicly funded work experience opportunities, which the state can afford in some cases. And you have to make them meaningful and help young people get into those easily and transition out of them as well. So you need all of the approaches. There's no single one that will solve this really complex challenge. And that's why when you mentioned, I think, what the top few challenges rated as risks in governments and politics around the world, youth employment ranks alongside climate change and nuclear threats. This is the single biggest political issue on every ballot in Africa. We know this. And governments want to prioritize job creation and promise jobs as part of their election manifestos, and yet they don't know how to deliver them.
This is the question. I have to jump in here because there's so many things you've said now that I want to touch on, but I also want to, because there's just so many different directions we can take this conversation. But on this last thing you said about it being a priority on every sort of manifesto, and everyone is promising that when we come in, we're going to get XYZ number of people, and they're putting numbers. They're like, we're going to get 1 million, people into jobs, or we're going to create whatever it is. And I think the issue there is because it's such an obvious and pressing issue, governments can be seen to not be doing anything. It would be, what would be the basis of your campaigns if you don't have any job manifesto or youth engagement and employment manifesto or component to your manifesto? But then the question is, what works?
Yep.
Because it's to the point of, okay, we want to create 1 million jobs in XYZ sector, for example.
Yep.
How do you make that happen?
Yep.
What are the opportunities to implement whatever ideology or ideas that you have, which then comes to like all these active labor market policies. There's the job search. Okay, you need to match the job seeker with the job opportunity and kind of ease that friction between demand and supply.
Right.
Then there's job skills training. Okay, you know what? Our youth actually don't have the skills. Let's train them, and somehow they will find themselves into jobs. Or it could be like vocational training or wage subsidies. You mentioned like public employment opportunities that you can actually kind of co-create with governments and other parts of the economic space. But then the question is, from your experience, and I think also from Harambe's work, what works?
Yeah.
And I want to kind of touch on a couple of things here, like job training, for example. There's a paper by World Bank researcher. I've also mentioned this in one of the other episodes about the success rates of job training.
Yeah.
So I think it's about 3 of every 100 actually get into a job after being trained. Then there's the job assistance, or job search assistance interventions. But then even if you match every single person who is equipped or skilled today, there aren't enough jobs anyway to get everyone like equal numbers, even if we're talking about 80%, for example.
Yeah.
And then there's all the other things that people kind of come up with, or implementing organizations come up with. From your experience, like you've mentioned 1.4 million job opportunities created, what would you say are the most effective policies, or not as policies, but also like most effective ways to implement these programs? Because it's one thing to have a policy, it's another thing to implement.
Okay.
It's another thing to measure, another thing to iterate when you then measure. So I know there's also another kind of broad, open-ended question. But
sure. So I'm going to answer your question in a few parts. First, let me take the political space, right? Like, let me just answer the government politics question. This is my own pet phrase now, which is youth employment is deeply political and deeply apolitical. By deeply political, it is almost in every election manifesto, as we know. Yeah. It's deeply apolitical because it doesn't matter what political party is in power. Young people need to benefit. And that is sort of the reason why you have to actually, as Harambe, we've taken a very conscious choice. Even though we are a presidential initiative now and we work with the ANC DA coalition right now, the GNU, we were sort of seeded by the Cyril Ramaphosa presidency, but we're not a political entity. We cannot be, because we have to serve young people. That is the mission. The mission is serving young people, right? And so youth employment has to be seen as apolitical and political at the same time. And organizations working in this space need to know that that's critical. So you can't be politicized. And I mean, government and politics has to, do what it does, which is promise things, etc. Yeah. But we cannot get into the trap of letting that derail us from the fact that we have to serve young people first. Yeah. That has to be at the core of everything we do. And then the second thing on that note is, governments, in order to win elections, or politicians to win elections, will promise things. But we cannot let that, again, derail what is important as a multifaceted, multi-stakeholder approach to the problem, right? That leads me to sort of solutions and models that work. I think some values and principles that have been at the core of what Harambe has done from the get-go have been, one, is that you cannot, as a single organization or innovative social enterprise, solve this problem. This is too complex because it is not a supply-side problem. It is not a demand-side problem. It is all of the problems together. It's about growth. It's about young people with their skills. It's about, sectors growing. It's about investments. So you cannot solve it alone. That's the one. And who do you solve it with? You have to have 3 parts. It's a sort of 3-legged stool. It's social enterprise, like ourselves, to drive inclusion, to focus and center on young people, and to hopefully innovate within the social impact space. You have to have private sector because they are the forces of growth and efficiency and innovation in the country, and will be employers of youth and pay the bills and the taxes. Yeah. And you need government for scale and depth and policy, as you said. And so we realized early on, and I'll give a couple of examples. In the early days of Harambe, we focused a lot on demand-led skilling, so jobs of today. So, for example, in the early days, we were founded by a group called the Yellowwoods Group, which also is a holding company for organizations, companies like Nando's and Hollard. And Nando's, if you like chicken, you probably know what it is. But Nando's, I love, informally, they refer themselves to as a youth employment organization that serves chicken, which I found really interesting. Because the point is, South Africa, despite its GDP, etc., has such a high youth unemployment, and young people couldn't find those Nando's jobs of cashiers or delivery or sales, etc., and that was shocking. So when Harambe was founded, we started off with the ethos that, great, there are jobs that do exist today that young people can do. Let's bridge that gap. Let's bridge it with breaking the barriers to the gaps. So how do you look for a job? Can you make that cheaper and more affordable? And what are the components of a job itself? So don't ask for 2 years work experience for an entry-level job. Ask for what you need and break that down a bit. And so Harambe's core ethos back in the day was bridging that gap, breaking barriers for young people, for inclusive jobs of today. You mentioned job matching, etc. So we run our platform, SA Youth, which is 4 million young people right now, precisely on that premise, which is jobs of today can be done by young people of today. We just need to break those barriers down and get them in front of employers as quickly as possible.
Let me just, I know we probably have a couple of things to say, but I wanted to just double click on this. You've kind of painted the landscape of, okay, this is a multi-sector, multi-stakeholder issue that needs not just one actor. It needs every single, from the private sector, from the public sector, from the third sector, if you want to call it that, like the social enterprises. But then the question there is that sometimes there might be misaligned incentives, right? So from the private sector, maybe you want to hire fast, maybe not necessarily hire fast, maybe also hire, like, keep your headcount low. Sometimes automation might also kind of, the question of technology, and we'll come to that in a little while. But also, like, incentives from the government, there's like election cycles and so on and so forth. And also different political agendas, how we can really break that down here. And then how do you then find that common ground? Maybe using the SA Youth example.
That is the work, right? The work is finding common ground between those three very misaligned incentives. And you'll be surprised, there's more common ground than we think or give credit for. And I think these days, and I think this is why Africa in general can be potentially a beacon for what's possible, because I think a lot of our institutions and institutional arrangements have been conceived of in a very Western world view that, government is bad or private sector is great. And it's much more nuanced than that. And I think in South Africa in particular, the example that I was going to get to about job creation, which I'll get to in a second, is a perfect example of how you can align incentives. Because everyone wants inclusive growth. No one really can sit back and say, I don't want growth or I don't want inclusion. You can say that. You could sort of pull both ends of that string. But inclusive growth benefits everyone. And the incentives, as you said, for private sector to maximize efficiency, to optimize, to put shareholder value first, etc., exists. It's a good thing to have. It cannot be excessive. It needs to be moderated. Similarly with government, trying to reach scale and, not necessarily fund everything or loopholes in other spaces, etc. But, there's middle ground. And what we found in Harambe, and the example I was going to get to, which was we worked specifically in the global business services industry. We identified a sector. And just before even I mentioned the example, is what we realized is it was insufficient for us to place young people into jobs of today. We had to create jobs of tomorrow. And the GBS example specifically outlines is a proof point of aligning incentives to the question you're asking. And that's why I'm going to bring it up in that context, which is we saw examples of a sector, the global business services sector, growing despite other sectors not growing as much. That's the one. And the second is it was able to absorb young people. And we saw an opportunity here to say, we can get an employer to come to South Africa and hire a young person, great. But what if we did that times 100? And who would be the right partners to do that? Private sector could benefit because more and more employers coming in, etc. They grow their businesses, and a lot of people come to Africa, to South Africa and other countries for commercial incentives, but they stay for others. And government would benefit as well because there's FDI, there's new investors coming in, etc. So we put together this tripartite sort of coalition almost between ourselves, the industry body association called BPESA, Business Process Enabling South Africa, the DTIC, the Department of Trade and Industry. And we said, what if we actually created a sector master plan to drive growth in this sector? Everyone benefits. As I said, inclusive growth is a term that everyone should and learn and love, because you know that you want growth in the economy, and you want growth to also benefit the people who've been excluded, particularly young people. So we found that identifying that sector and collaborating across these three parties, social sector, government, private sector, was highly enabling of these aligned incentives. And we quite literally helped draft some of the incentives that are in place right now for the industry to both bring in foreign investment, but importantly, to have this foreign investment support the hiring of young people. The only other thing that I'll mention before moving on from that example is that that's incredibly hard. It's hard to get parties who think very differently and who have different mandates to sit at the table. It's work that we do literally every day. But it is the only work that actually will get things done. It is impossible for us to just say private sector will fix this, or government will fix this, or social sector will fix this. We have to do this all the time. And sort of squaring off the corners of all three. And I'm pleased to say that we're replicating this model in Rwanda. For example, we have similarly incubated an entity in Rwanda that is doing this in partnership with the government and private sector. I chair the board of that entity in partnership with the Minister of ICT, as well as the CEO of RDB. And this is specifically designed to grow jobs for young Rwandans. And this can be done in other countries, in other sectors, in other spaces. I'm optimistic. But for me, to answer the question that you asked, which is how to align incentives, there is middle ground to be had. The negotiation is constant, and you sort of have to draw on different muscles all the time between the three.
Every day, 247. I love that. I think you actually kind of led or segued directly into my next question. And one of the things I was going to call out was the work in Rwanda, right? So, like you mentioned, you're also the chair of the Rwandan Global Business Services Growth Initiative Advisory Board, which was essentially that: how do we build out this sector in Rwanda to attract private sector actors and enterprises, and also create jobs for the young people in the country. And that's an example of, to some extent, replicating the work that you had started in South Africa.
Right.
But then thinking through whether that then cuts across all other countries, and not to say that it's a cut and paste thing, but thinking about the question of scale, which is the key thing, right? Because the numbers are just too large to kind of think about piecemeal opportunities. The sector-wide thinking and strategy and master plan, as you called it, is the most effective way to reach the end that we want to reach, right? So what are you learning, would you say, from like the experience of trying to deploy skilled initiatives? If we're thinking about replicating that sort of initiative in another country, maybe something with completely different demographics, like I think Djibouti is like 1 million population total. That's not South Africa. That's not Nigeria, for example. So thinking through how this is relevant in other countries in the continent. And also just something I wanted to mention is that why we keep on talking about youth unemployment, for people that might not know, right? Because then you say, okay, unemployment is unemployment. It doesn't matter what age anyone needs to get into a job, as long as you get them into a job. But then there's the question of, let me just call out the specific stat, because I have it here. So Africa's youth unemployment rate is double the global average.
Yes.
And even the highest income countries, like the middle to high income, like Seychelles, Gabon, Botswana, they have the exact same challenge of like 1.5 to 4 times the youth and unemployment rate versus their like average employment rate. The question people might then ask is, why do you need to, how would I say this now? So if you, okay, let me use a research paper that I read where they were talking about, even if you improve job search assistance and you improve the frictions between young people and opportunities, that's just like replacing the person in the job. You haven't necessarily created a job, right?
Absolutely.
So you've just kind of moved the number. Okay, maybe there's less young people unemployed, but then there's still
we call it shuffling the queue.
Shuffling the queue.
I mean, absolutely. So that's why I mentioned inclusive hiring is one piece of it, which is a critical piece of it, but inclusive job growth is also a second and important pillar, and you need both. But just to go back to sort of the basics again in terms of people understanding the complexity of youth employment, right? And I think I alluded to it a little bit, but it's a supply problem. And supply in this case, at least in the Harambe context, we talk about young people. So supply of young people coming on board with skills, barriers, lack of access, all of that. And it is a demand problem, which is growth for jobs and actual, employers that are in this space, etc. You mentioned reducing friction, vital. Skilling, critical. Job growth, vital as well. You need all of it. You can pick your lane and solve one piece of the puzzle. But it is important for actors in the space, especially governments and policymakers and industry bodies and people who have sort of a macro view, to really take a big step back to say, what are we solving for?
Yeah.
We're solving for a system. And I think one of the strengths that Harambe has been able to lean into, we've moved beyond just almost scaling a product to solving a problem. And that requires you to move beyond scale in terms of just numbers alone to systems change. And you kind of have to play a delicate dance between the two. You can't do the one without the other. Scale impact systems change and vice versa. We can't say that we're a systems change player and work just in the hundreds. We can't.
Yeah.
But you have to have both. And so I think to answer your question, though, I think is to solve this problem at scale across the continent requires multiple organizations, multiple governments, multiple teams thinking in this way. And you cannot, many people have asked, can you scale Harambe and can you do this across all of Africa? I mean, we could. But actually, it's about many other organizations picking up the mantle of what we currently do and doing what they're doing well as well, but doing it in a way that specifically leans on a few principles that, let me just sort of like focus on principles that I think have really made a difference. One is multi-stakeholder collaboration, the three parties that I mentioned. Yeah. Two is, for me, it has to be demand-led skilling. The third principle I would say is being youth-centered. And I think this is a philosophy that Harambe has kind of intuitively had from day one. And then a few maybe other principles. We're tech-enabled. I wouldn't say tech is a huge part of what we do. And you asked the question about AI, etc. But tech is an enabler. It will always be an enabler for us. It is not the thing, but it does allow us to do incredible things. For example, we had this fabulous call this morning, in fact, where some of our contact center agents, we have a 24/7 support service for young people, some of which is staffed by live contact center agents during the day. And they basically pick up the phone every day and service young people that are unemployed and looking for work. And they are using AI right now to both automate their services, to improve their efficiency, to help them analyze scripts. So, for example, I'm sure you know, but contact center agents are often rated on lots of optimization. How long did you take on a call? Did you solve the problem? Etc. Did a call drop? AI is helping our contact center agents who serve unemployed youth to do their job better. That's great. It's a win-win. And AI is sometimes helping resolve problems that, our contact center agents need not solve, like password resets. And so I think for us, tech-enabled is, I think, a third or fourth principle that I was trying to get at, because everyone thinks tech is the solution. It is an enabler for the solution. And I think we need to be very clear about that. And maybe just the last thing is, it's more of a mantra than a real principle, is you have to remain in love with the problem, not your solution. It's something that I think we borrowed from Lean Impact, a book that we were featured in by Anne-May Chang. And you have to think of the problem as a growing problem, as a changing problem. It's not a static problem. You have to remain in love with that problem. And our problem is young people not finding work. So remaining in love with the problem rather than your fancy little solution is the critical sort of mindset that we sort of come to this with. And then, so those would sort of be principles that help underpin how we can solve this problem at scale. So it isn't, I can't tell you, hey, take SA Youth and do this in Kenya and Nigeria and you'll be fine. It's impossible. And we would be kidding ourselves if that were the case. We can share what we've done and sort of distill the principles. But it would be up to folks in Kenya and Nigeria to take that on and do this in the ways that I've perhaps described.
So those three, multi-stakeholder, demand-led, youth-enabled, youth-centered, and then maybe
tech-enabled,
sprinkle some tech in there. One thing I would say, though, is that I don't even know where to start really, Sharmi, because there's so much to kind of touch on and to address as well. And I also know where.
Sorry, I know
have
I keep giving you so much. Like this is such a big challenge.
It is a big challenge, but let me just kind of round up with 2 or 3 questions.
Sure.
I'll pivot a little bit to care work, which I know is also one of your personal passions as well. One of the problems that you're in love with, and maybe also tie that in with technology and the future of, how does technology impact work and job opportunities. I think I saw this. This is actually on your TED Talk. I think I saw you quoted this. By 2030, over 2 billion people will need care, spotlighting care work as a booming sector demanding innovation and flexible policies. And the ILO estimates that globally, over 400 million jobs could be generated in this sector, given the demographic trends of aging and overall population growth. On one hand, the numbers in terms of 400 million jobs, that sounds great. Like we're trying to figure out, okay, where can we create jobs, right? And then there's also the element of unpaid care work, right? So a lot of care work is unpaid, so wasn't considered a job in terms of economic or income generation or economic impact in that sense of like remuneration. My initial question was going to be, how, if anything, does emerging technologies impact the growth of this sector in any way? Because care work is something that is very human and very physical. Like until we get to a point where robots can, I don't know, change baby nappies, like that, it's still very much going to be a human endeavor. Yeah. So, kind of your thoughts in terms of how technology can enable maybe better remuneration for these sorts of work or time spent on caring for family or loved ones or whoever else. But then also thinking about, can African governments be more intentional about focusing on this sector as an opportunity? As we said, that more and more people will need care because of aging populations. But then in the same way you've talked about like global business services and call centers and setting up those sector-wide, manifestos and master plans and then implementing them, what are the opportunities to do this sort of thing for countries in Africa to think about, okay, this is an opportunity to create new jobs, and how can we make that happen in reality? Sure.
So I'm going to answer your question in a few buckets. We are at a unique demographic sort of tipping point as well, right? You have an aging global north and a young, vibrant, reasonably jobless, unfortunately, global south, or at least Africa. And so there's one bucket of work that has to honestly grapple with that, because we want to be able to not exploit that situation, but understand how to take advantage of that situation in a way that affords meaningful, dignified work opportunities for young people, and solve actual social challenges. These are not, no one's saying that you've got to take care of the elderly in Europe, and so let's ship off all of our young people. But there are opportunities there, right? Like we can think of, and there are some great organizations that are doing some interesting work in this space to ensure that we create safe passage, safe opportunities, safe skilling. We know that, I think there's a lot of research on, studies on sort of the home care aid industry, both from the Philippines and I think in India, which suggests that if well run, this could actually be sources of remittances, sources of skilling, etc. And no one wants brain drain. No one wants sort of like exploitation. But within the safeguards of those, how can you create opportunities that take advantage of this sort of demographic phenomenon that we have on our hands? We have aging populations and young populations without work. What can you do? So I think that has to be an area of exploration, and it has to be in an area that is done ethically. It is done reasonably well. We need solid pilots on the ground before we can say, let's scale it up in every country. And we have to ensure that the interests of all countries and citizens are well taken care of. So for me, there's a component of that has to be explored. And I think care is one of those where we can actually test things out. And to the second bucket of responses I will give is around technology. No matter what we use technology for, and this is why I used technology as an enabler, even for Harambe's work, is human touch is vital for everything. I mean, if anyone has had a child, they know that they cannot outsource the human touch aspect of things, no matter how many useful apps tell you what to do as a parent. How often you need to breastfeed or what your APGAR scores are. That will never replace the requirement for care between humans. And so thinking of technology as an enabler, as an innovator, already the research is out there, I think, which shows that AI is a powerful tutor for people just because of the valuable sort of information that customizes to a young person's learning journey. But it can never replace a teacher, because a teacher is the one that sort of spots which child needs what kind of information or what potential can be unlocked. So to think of technology as an enabler and not as something that displaces or replaces human care is vital in this space. So we need all of the innovations. We need the care innovations. I just looked at a report, I think it was released 3 or 4 days ago by Pivotal Ventures in the US, which focuses on investments and innovations in the care economy. And there are so many really valuable innovations being created in the care space, whether it's understanding how to ensure the prevention of elder care fraud, for example, because elderly people are vulnerable and can be taken advantage of. So how do we ensure that no one gets trapped into insurance fraud or care fraud, etc.? Or if there are opportunities for people to manage day-to-day care or childcare aggregation platforms, those are technological innovations that will never replace the need for a human to actually care for another human. So that's a second bucket in terms of tech as a source of innovation, but not the thing that will solve the problem alone, right? Yeah. The solution is care, fundamentally. And then the last thing I will say, the ILO, I think, put a paper out 2-3 years ago saying that there were likely 3 economies that will power the world in the future: the care economy, the digital economy, and the green economy. Note that these aren't sectors, these aren't job families. These are economies with value chains up and down. But if we think of these 3 as economies of the future that we will need everything from, and you'll need manufacturing, you'll need tech, you'll need people, but that allows us to then sort of expand how we think about where our investments should go, because humans will always be frail when they're born and be frail when they're about to die and will need care. So that's a given. Plan for that in terms of investment in innovation, investment in workforce, investment in dignified opportunities. Plan according to that sort of economy and its value chains. Similarly with digital. Digital is here to stay. No one's kicking it out.
Well, the rhetoric is that's actually going to kick us out. But
we'll get to AI in a second. And then green, right? Yeah. We have one planet and we need to preserve it. And despite Elon Musk's, ideas to the contrary, we might not have a choice but to protect this planet. And so I think if you think of these as drivers for how to invest and think of workforce development, job creation, skilling, training, etc., it allows governments to really change the shape of the economy to suit the needs of its people. And so I think care in that lens, I think about care a lot in that vein, not just early childhood care. It's care across the value chain. It's elder care, it's disability care, and it's care of all kinds. Yeah. So those would be sort of 3 or 4 responses. I mean, obviously we have a lot to do, and I haven't even talked about unpaid care and recognition and reward of people who do care, etc. Yeah. But I think these at least 3 sort of prongs could be opportunities for governments and the private sector to get engaged in terms of investments.
And I think one, maybe to round us off in terms of going back to the question of like definitions and meaning and measurement, you've talked about like care work and unpaid care work and the need to maybe redefine the way we've historically interacted with these different sectors of the care economy, for example, or the digital economy and the green economy. How can we be thinking about this to meet the needs of the future and thinking about how we can plan for that now and start to implement now so that we're not like always kind of trying to play catch up.
Right.
But then the question, and one thing you had mentioned at the beginning was jobless growth, right? Yeah. And it feels like governments have to keep on juggling this GDP as the measure of success and of any given country or geographic area versus unemployment and how do you kind of balance unemployment rates with GDP growth. And there's all these economic frameworks like Okun's law, which I just recently came across, which is like how can you statistically define a relationship between unemployment rates and GDP growth and how do you keep both of them stable. And there's another paper I also read recently that spoke about employment-led growth policy as opposed to growth-led employment policy. And the question here, do we need to just redefine what is success for governments in that sense of, is it more about the GDP? Okay, we've gotten, I don't know, what would be like high income? I don't know, 12,000. Is it 12? I think the highest, Seychelles around 12,000 USD GDP per capita, something like that, which is the highest income country in Africa. Or are we thinking about some other sort of measure? Like how we, what is success, and what should governments and also all other kind of stakeholders, being private sector, social enterprises, be thinking about as the North Star?
Yeah.
Right. You've mentioned like youth-centric.
Yeah.
Or like more like issue-centric, as opposed to just thinking about, okay, how do we solve for, and then rushing to solutions. But I think just to think about unemployment as a topic, what should be the focus, and how should we sort of reorient? This is a very broad and open-ended question again.
It is, but I think it's a good one. So firstly, with all the caveats, I'm not a macroeconomist, right? Like I will just say that.
Neither
because
am
I want to make sure that none of what I'm saying comes from that grounding, or it comes from the work of a practitioner in the space. That being said, 2 points. One is, firstly, I'm a huge fan of an economist named Mariana Mazzucato, who talks about mission economies. And two things that I think she talks about that are really valuable. One is your economy should have a mission. Second, you know, the state is actually much more entrepreneurial than we think, and has innovated really these vast amounts of infrastructure, etc. For example, the US defense budget was the reason that GPS was invented, etc. Now we use iPhones as a result, or Uber. So those 2 points for me are really valuable from a macroeconomic perspective. One, because mission economy for me is an intuitive thing. It appeals to me because what is the reason for your economy and your GDP growth? It isn't just for GDP growth, and it's not shareholder value maximization or so that the top 1% can benefit. It ought to have a mission. And I think employment in many African countries is that mission, right? It has to be. And you have to figure out what the sort of calibration between employment and growth is. And we did some research in Harambe in South Africa over the past 15 years. And we noticed that GDP growth rate, while slow and, you know, growing, was correlated positively to job growth rate above 34, but not below. Or rather above 35, but not below. So young people were not benefiting from even the tiny amounts of growth that we did have. So just to unpack that a bit. So GDP, you know, there's an assumption that when GDP grows, jobs will come. And when jobs come, they benefit young people. And in South Africa, we saw that it was just not true. It wasn't coming. You know, firstly, there were fewer jobs than we thought. And then secondly, those jobs were not coming to young people. There's many reasons for this, and we can speculate. We don't really know. But my sense is this is unfortunately coming soon to a theater near everyone, unfortunately, because it's going to be the case that we have both jobless growth and growth that doesn't benefit the most excluded, particularly young people. And because we have so many young people in Africa, we're seeing it in the stats. So the reason I want to belabor that point is we have to be employment-led. We cannot afford to be growth-led alone, because, I mean, we will have multiple Arab Springs on our hands if we cannot get our young people working. Just the size of the problem alone determines that. Just to give you a stat that, you know, keeps me up at night, in South Africa, there are 9 million young people that are not in education, employment, and training. That is the size of the country of Austria. Just to give you an example, it's the size of the country of Austria. That's unconscionable, and also a social crisis waiting to happen. So there are many reasons why I, as a practitioner, not as a macroeconomist, believe in employment-led growth and in inclusive growth. And I personally don't think we have a choice as many countries in the future. You know, we are going to be grappling with inequality. And inequality is not a problem in a faraway country or province or territory. It will impact you. And these choices, the last thing I'll say on this is the price of inequality will not be felt, may not be felt immediately, but will be felt. And apartheid is a perfect example of that, right? It was a system that was designed to be exclusive and to be unequal. And the country's paying the price for it right now. The price will be paid. It's a question of who pays it and when. And so we can just, you know, be kind of blithe about how to design our policies, our governments, and our, you know, or economies rather. And I think we need to know that all of these chickens are going to come home to roost. So inclusive growth for me is not a nice to have. It is the option, the only option. And there will be debate on what growth, which sectors. Is it manufacturing-led growth? What do you need to invest in? Those are good debates to have. But I don't think the debate can be whether it's inclusion or growth.
Yeah.
It has to be inclusive growth. Then just the last thing I'll say on that is the question of growth benefiting everyone, and what is the measure of a country's success? You mentioned sort of GDP growth, etc. We are going to have to tear that stuff down. We're going to, because we know that GDP growth is not infinite. Another great economist, Kate Raworth, talks about this all the time with donut economics. Infinite growth is going to kill us. It's going to be extractive, and we are going to pay the price. Again, we are paying the price from a climate perspective. So we need limits.
Yeah.
And it's understanding what limits we fit within, both in terms of the threshold of human dignity below which we cannot survive, and the ceiling above which it's too extractive for anyone.
Yeah.
I think is where we need to play.
Thank you so much, Sharmi. I feel like there's still so much to discuss, but we don't have all the time in the world.
Are we out of
And
time?
I appreciate
Oh, wow.
your
Okay.
time. I appreciate your time. And I think maybe just to round up would be those 3 points with the fourth wrapper about multi-stakeholder, demand-led, youth-centric, and also how can we enable the entire movement with tech in the way that is equitable, in a way that is inclusive and doesn't leave anybody behind. But yeah, thank you so much for being here, Sharmi. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share?
No, I think it's a new mantra that I'm adopting now, which is that there are no silver bullets. There's no single simple solution. If we're looking for that, then we are misguided. So we need all of the solutions, and we need to ensure that we invest in them appropriately with the right resources. But yeah, it's time that we rewrite Africa's headline for the next few years ourselves.
Thank you. You heard it here first. Rewrite Africa's headlines. Thank you for watching, and see you on the next episode.